The first night in the farmhouse was quiet, almost unnaturally so. Sarah Whitlock had hoped for that kind of silence when she uprooted her life and brought her 12-year-old son Dylan to the rural outskirts of Pennsylvania. The old wooden house creaked with age, but there was a certain comfort in the isolation, a chance to heal, to start over. Dylan had fallen asleep quickly, his small frame wrapped in blankets, still clutching the book he'd brought in the car. Sarah stayed up, reading over bills and contracts, too wired to rest. At exactly 3 a.m., a scream shattered the stillness. It wasn't human, but it wasn't entirely animal either. It ripped through the night like a blade, long and guttural, echoing across the fields with a rising pitch that made Sarah drop her pen. She sat frozen, staring at the window, her breath caught in her throat. Another scream followed. This time, Dylan's voice called out from his room, scared and shaking. "Mom!" She rushed to him, trying to keep her panic buried. "It's okay." "Probably just an animal." He clutched her tightly. That didn't sound like any animal. She didn't disagree. It came again, a sound so raw, so hollowed out, it seemed torn from something that shouldn't exist anymore. Sarah walked to the back door, opened it a crack and listened. The wind rustled the cornfields, crickets chirped. And then, there it was again. Louder, closer. The barn. She had noticed the barn earlier that day, weathered and leaning but still solid. The realtor had said it was mostly used for storing equipment and a few old animals. She hadn't bothered to check it yet. Now the source of the unearthly sound was unmistakable. She locked the door. If you're already feeling the chills, don't forget to hit that subscribe button, because what happens next will make you question everything. Morning came slow and grey. Sarah made coffee, bleary-eyed, trying to shake the unease. Dylan refused to leave his bed. He said he dreamt of a black mouth and hooves scraping stone. She chalked it up to nerves. New place, new bed, bad dreams. Still, the screams haunted her. Determined to understand what they were dealing with, Sarah headed to the barn alone. The door groaned open on rusted hinges. Inside, the smell of hay and dust hit her like a wave. It was colder than she expected. Much colder. In the far stall, barely visible through the dim light, stood the goat, its eyes fixed on her immediately, deep, glassy, and unnatural. One horn curled back while the other had snapped off long ago, leaving only a jagged stump. Its beard was matted, fur patchy, and yet it stood perfectly still, watching. Sarah took a step closer. The goat let out a low, almost conversational bleat. Harmless, almost gentle. She searched for a tag, a sign of ownership, but found nothing. It didn't move. It didn't blink. Something about it made her skin crawl. She turned to leave, but stopped at the sight of strange marks scratched into the stall wall. Spirals, lines, and what looked like eyes. Too symmetrical to be random, too deep to be made by hooves. That night, the scream returned. Again at 3 a.m., again from the barn. Again, Dylan woke up shaking, tears in his eyes. And again, Sarah could do nothing but hold him and whisper lies she didn't believe. It's just a goat, just a sound. But something inside her knew, goats don't scream like that, and no ordinary animal watches a person without blinking. For hours. The second morning began with a thick layer of fog clinging to the fields. Sarah stood by the window with a cup of lukewarm coffee, staring at the barn. No sounds now, no screams. Just a silence that stretched too long and weighed too heavily. Dylan was quiet over breakfast. He pushed cereal around his bowl, eyes sunken, lips pressed into a thin line. She reached across the table, touched his hand. "You okay?" He didn't look up. "It watched me last night." Her stomach tightened. "The goat?" He nodded. "Through the window. I saw its eyes." I couldn't sleep. Sarah glanced toward the barn again. It was impossible from that angle. The goat would have had to walk out, cross the yard, and stand outside his bedroom. It didn't make sense, but she didn't argue. Instead, she offered him a weak smile. "We'll figure this out. Maybe it needs help. Maybe it's just scared too." After breakfast, Dylan stayed inside with his book while Sarah went out again. She needed to see it in daylight to make sense of the scream and the strange carvings. She needed something to hold on to. The barn smelled older than it looked. It wasn't just decay. It was the scent of forgotten things. Sarah moved slowly, checking the corners, studying the structure. There were chains hanging from a beam above the stall. She hadn't noticed them last time. The goat, still standing in the same place, watched her enter. This time she didn't look away. "You're not going to scream now?" she asked softly. It blinked, then turned its head slightly, almost in response. The marks on the stall wall looked clearer now. Spirals, circles within circles. A shape like an eye repeated over and over again, scratched so deeply the wood had splintered. She touched one. It was cold. At the far end of the barn, something shifted. A soft scuffle. She followed the sound to a trap door beneath a pile of broken crates. It was old and sealed shut with rusted nails. Her breath hitched. Why would there be a sealed door under the barn? She backed away. That afternoon, Dylan wandered out. The sun had burned away the fog, but the air still felt heavy. He stood at the edge of the barn, hesitating. Sarah noticed him and waved. "Want to meet him?" Dylan nodded and walked over slowly. As he stepped inside, the goat turned toward him. This time it moved, just a few steps, enough to make Dylan freeze. But it didn't charge or threaten. It stopped in front of the boy, tilted its head, and let out a quiet, rasping bleat. Dylan exhaled. "It doesn't look scary." Sarah watched closely. "No. But it feels like it should." He crouched, peered into the straw. "What's this?" There were scratch marks on the floor too, not hoof marks. These were different, longer, deeper. They led toward the stall's corner, right to a plank that was slightly loose. Sarah pulled at it and revealed a hollow beneath. Dust swirled, revealing something buried. A shoe, small, molded by time, too small for an adult. She didn't say anything, just pushed the board back down. That night she locked every door and window. She left a light on in the hallway and sat in her room, listening. The clock ticked forward. 1:30, 2:45. At 3 o'clock sharp, the scream came again. Longer this time. Sarah held her breath. Then came a second sound, like something dragging across wood. Dylan knocked on her door seconds later. "I don't think it's just the goat," he whispered. She didn't answer. She didn't know how. The third night began before the sun had fully set. Sarah closed the curtains early, bolted the doors and placed a chair under the front doorknob. She didn't say why. Dylan noticed, of course, but he said nothing. They both had agreed, without saying it out loud, that something was wrong here. Dinner was quiet. Dylan only picked at his food. "Do you think it's trying to tell us something?" he asked. Sarah looked at him for a long time. "I think it wants us to look away." Outside, the wind stirred the trees. The goat hadn't made a sound all day, but that only made the tension worse. They both waited, counting minutes without realizing it. By 11, Sarah was pacing the hallway. Dylan was in bed but not asleep. He left his light on. The house creaked and shifted. Every sound felt magnified. At 2:58 a.m., Sarah stood at the window. She didn't know why. Maybe she hoped it wouldn't happen this time. Maybe she wanted to be ready. At exactly 3 a.m. it screamed, not just once. It screamed again, and again. Sarah covered her ears, but the sound tore through her body, vibrating in her chest like thunder. She opened her eyes and saw something that made her blood run cold. The barn door was open. She hadn't left it that way. She rushed to Dylan's room. He was sitting up, eyes wide, staring at the window. "I saw it," he whispered. "Saw what?" It wasn't the goat this time. Something was behind it. Sarah didn't ask. She didn't want to know more. The next morning, the barn door was closed again. Sarah was certain she hadn't touched it. She approached cautiously, holding her breath as she stepped inside. The air was sharp with the scent of iron. The goat stood where it always did, unmoving, but now deep scratches covered the door. They hadn't been there before. Some were high, too high. Dylan came out after breakfast. He stayed near the doorway, not wanting to enter. He stared at the goat for a while. "It screamed louder last night," he said, "like it was warning us." Sarah didn't reply. She walked around the interior of the barn, eyes scanning every surface. More symbols. Some etched into the beams, others newer, scratched into the floor. One had been carved into the side of the stall, an eye inside a jagged triangle. "Do you think someone comes here at night?" Dylan asked. "I don't know." They both turned at the sound of tires crunching gravel. An old faded pickup had pulled into the driveway. Behind the wheel sat a woman, elderly, thin, dressed in layers of mismatched clothes. Her hair was pinned back in an uneven braid. She stepped out without waiting for an invitation and walked straight toward the barn. Sarah stepped between her and Dylan. "Can I help you?" The woman gave a crooked smile. "I'm Alma. I live down the hill." "Figured you might need some company." Sarah stiffened. "Why would you think that?" Alma's eyes narrowed, scanning the barn interior. She pointed toward the stall. "He's still here, isn't he?" Sarah didn't know what to say. Alma didn't wait for an answer. "You don't let him out," she said flatly. "You hear me? You lock that door and you don't listen when he screams." "Why?" Dylan asked. Alma looked at the boy for the first time. "Because he's waking up again." She turned to leave without another word, walking slowly back to her truck like it was all she came to say. She didn't wait for a response. Didn't look back. Sarah stood in silence, the barn suddenly much colder. Dylan finally spoke. "What does that mean?" Sarah didn't know, but she could feel it too. Something was changing. And the goat wasn't the only thing in that barn anymore. Sarah spent the rest of the day pretending Alma hadn't come. She didn't mention the visit to Dylan, didn't call the sheriff, didn't even touch the barn door again. But her mind wouldn't stop racing. Who was he? Why was Alma so sure the goat shouldn't be let out? And what did waking up again even mean? That night, Sarah opened the box of documents left by the previous owner. The pile was mostly junk, expired insurance forms, grain invoices, and handwritten feed schedules, but at the bottom, tucked inside a cracked leather folder, she found something that made her chest tighten. A faded property map, hand-drawn, and in small, neat handwriting beside the barn. "Don't disturb below. Keep sealed." She stared at those words for a long time. The next morning she drove into town while Dylan stayed home reading. She needed answers. The local library was small, but the clerk behind the desk recognized her immediately. "You bought the Price place, didn't you?" Sarah nodded. "Do you know anything about it?" The woman hesitated, then lowered her voice. "That's an old name around here. Lot of talk. People still won't walk past it after dark." "Why?" She shrugged. "It's just stories. That family was strange, kept to themselves, disappeared almost 20 years ago." "All of them?" The woman nodded. "Father, mother, 2 boys. One of them was just a teenager. No bodies ever found. Some say they ran off, others say the land swallowed them whole." Sarah forced a weak smile. "You mean that literally?" The woman didn't answer. Instead, she pointed to a dusty binder on a nearby shelf labeled Obituaries and Events, 1990s. Sarah flipped through until she found it, an article from June 2004. "Local family vanishes without trace. Price Farm investigated." According to the piece, neighbors had reported screams coming from the barn in the weeks before the disappearance. The sheriff had searched the home and found nothing. The goat, described as a large, aggressive buck, was the only living thing left. Same goat, it couldn't be. But the photograph in the article showed it clearly. One horn snapped, the same mangled beard. Sarah's hands went cold. She called the sheriff that afternoon. Sheriff Tom Rayleigh answered on the second ring. His voice was flat, tired. "I live at the Price property," she began. Long silence. "I know," he finally said. "There's a goat here, screams every night. There's something under the barn. I think something's not right." Another pause. She could hear him shifting papers. "Is the animal hurt?" "No." "Is it threatening you or the boy?" "No, but then there's nothing I can do unless it's a safety concern." "You don't even want to come look?" "I've looked before," he said quietly. "There's nothing there worth digging up." Click. Sarah stared at the phone in disbelief. He knew. That night, Dylan came into her room before bed. He held a notebook, pages covered in drawings, swirls, eyes, symbols from the barn, all copied by hand. "I think it's a message," he said. She took the book. "Where did you find all these?" "I've been going in during the day, watching." "Dylan, I didn't touch anything, but I think it's not the goat that screams. I think it's something else. The goat's scared too." She didn't respond. He looked up at her. "Are we safe here?" She couldn't lie. "I don't know." That night, the scream came later. 3:07 a.m., followed by silence, then a knock at the back door. 3 soft taps. Sarah didn't move, didn't breathe. She just stared into the dark hallway, her heart hammering so hard she thought it might wake the house. Sarah didn't sleep after the knocking. She sat upright until the pale blue light of dawn bled through the curtains. There were no footprints outside when she checked, no sign that anyone had approached the door. The grass was undisturbed. Even the dew was untouched. But she knew what she'd heard. Dylan didn't mention it the next morning. He acted normal, too normal. He poured cereal, read from a book, and even joked once. Sarah watched him closely. His hands trembled slightly. By afternoon, clouds had gathered low and grey. The fields swayed under the wind like something breathing. That night, Dylan waited until Sarah had gone to bed. He watched the clock tick closer to 3. He didn't know why he was so drawn to it now, why, despite the fear curling inside him, he had to go see. At 2:43 a.m., he slid from his bed. He moved quietly, careful not to wake his mother. The hall creaked beneath his feet, the kind of sound that always seemed louder at night. He unlocked the back door and stepped into the chill. The barn loomed ahead, darker than the sky. Something about it felt deeper, older than the rest of the farm. As he walked toward it, he passed the wooden swing set half-swallowed by weeds. The wind whispered through the stalks. He reached the barn. The door was cracked open. Inside, the goat stood in its usual place, but tonight its eyes glowed faintly, reflecting a dull orange light from the lantern Dylan carried. It turned toward him slowly, then looked down. Dylan followed its gaze. There in the dirt something protruded, something pale. He bent down, brushed the soil aside. A bone, small, child-sized. His breath caught. He stepped back instinctively, but the goat let out a low, guttural sound. Not a scream, not a bleat. It sounded like sorrow, like mourning. More bones were visible now. Fingers, a broken rib, a cracked skull too small to be an adult's. Dylan turned to run, but stopped when he saw them. Fresh marks scratched into the wall behind the stall. A message. "He waits below." He couldn't breathe. He stumbled out of the barn, leaving the lantern behind. The wind hit harder now, pushing against him as if trying to slow his escape. He ran to the house, heart pounding, cold in his chest. He didn't sleep. The next morning, Sarah found him on the couch, curled in a blanket, eyes wide. "What happened?" she asked, kneeling beside him. He didn't speak at first. Then he looked at her, voice hoarse. "There's something buried there." She believed him. She walked to the barn while the sun was still rising. She moved the dirt where Dylan had pointed. Bones, old, fragile. And underneath them, something worse, a plank. Another hidden panel like the one near the stall before. She pried it up with a crowbar and found a hole beneath it. Deep. The air rising from it was stale and damp. She shined her flashlight down but couldn't see the bottom. A wooden ladder descended into the dark. She didn't go down. Not yet. That evening, Dylan spoke up again. "I think it's been trying to show us. The goat. Every night it screams, it's pointing at the door." "Pointing at what?" "At whatever's still down there." Sarah stared at the barn through the window, goosebumps rising along her arms. The scream came again that night. But this time, it sounded different, closer, like it came from inside the house. Sarah stood in front of the trap door long after the sun had climbed into the sky. The barn around her seemed to breathe with her, slow, tense, alive. The hole beneath the plank waited, yawning open in silence. She hadn't told Dylan she was going back in. He was still asleep when she left the house. This time, she brought a flashlight and a length of rope. She tied the rope to one of the thick beams overhead and let it drop into the hole. The wooden ladder embedded into the dirt wall looked unstable. She didn't trust it. Dust spiraled up from the darkness below as she moved to the edge. The goat watched from its stall, perfectly still. She took one last breath and descended. The air shifted the deeper she went, thicker, colder. The smell of rot was suffocating, old and wet, like something had been buried for a long time and never meant to be found. Her boots sank into damp earth at the bottom. She turned slowly, light sweeping across stone walls. It wasn't just a root cellar. It was a room, circular, built with purpose. Symbols lined the stone, etched into the walls, carved into wooden beams. The same spirals and eyes, but older, cruder. One corner held a pile of straw, decomposed and black. Shackles hung from the wall above it, rusted and thick. Sarah's hands shook. She moved toward a wooden crate on the far side. Inside were dolls, cloth, hand-stitched, their faces blank. Some had missing limbs. Others were covered in something dark and flaked. A child's shoe rested beside them. She crouched down, touched the earth, and her fingers met something soft. Fabric, skin. She jerked back. That's when she heard it. Scratching. Not loud, not frantic. Slow, purposeful. From behind the wall. She stood, flashlight trembling in her grip, and backed away. The sound continued, rhythmic and constant. Scrape, pause, scrape. Something alive, something aware. She ran. Back up the rope, boots slipping. Her shoulder slammed against the edge of the hole as she pulled herself out. She didn't stop. She left the barn door swinging behind her. Dylan was waiting in the kitchen. "I woke up and you were gone." She sank into the chair, face pale. "There's a room under the barn." He sat across from her, quiet. "I know." She looked up sharply. "What do you mean?" "I've seen it in my dreams." Her throat went dry. "What happens in your dreams?" He hesitated. "There's a boy down there. He doesn't have eyes." Sarah stared at him. "That's not possible." Dylan looked out the window. "He's trying to talk to me, but I don't understand the words." That evening, Sarah went to the attic. The realtor had said most of it was empty, but she searched every corner anyway. At the far end, hidden behind a wall panel, she found a small box. Inside was a set of keys. Old, rusted. Each had a small paper tag tied with string. One read, "Cellar." Another, "Exterior lock." Her hand closed around them. She returned to the barn with Dylan beside her. The goat stared at them both. No sound. Just those eyes. Sarah moved to the heavy door at the back of the barn, one they had ignored until now. The padlock had rusted shut, but one key slid in cleanly. She turned it. The door groaned open. Behind it, a stone stairway descended into total blackness. This was different from the root hole, wider, built with care. The smell hit instantly, thick, decaying. Dylan stepped back. Sarah lowered her flashlight. The light caught something at the bottom, something that moved. Sarah didn't move. The flashlight beam flickered as it caught movement at the bottom of the stone stairs, a shift in the darkness, not quick, not sudden, slow and deliberate, like something was aware of being watched and didn't care. Dylan gripped her hand tightly. She could feel his fingers trembling. "Go back to the house," she whispered. He shook his head. "I'm not leaving you." "I said go." He hesitated, then ran. Alone, Sarah turned back to the stairwell. Whatever had moved was no longer visible. The shadows swallowed the bottom of the stairs again. She stood at the top for a moment, then closed the door and relocked it. Her fingers trembled around the key. Back inside, Dylan was pacing. "What was it?" he asked. "I don't know." He stared at her. "You believe me now, don't you? It's not just dreams." Sarah nodded slowly. "Something's down there." That night, the goat didn't scream. Not at 3. Not at all. Sarah and Dylan stayed awake, waiting. The silence felt heavier than the sound, oppressive, like the absence of the scream meant something worse. When morning came, they returned to the barn. The air was thick, humid, and strangely warm. The goat stood in its usual place, but its posture was different, lower, sunken. It looked exhausted. There were new markings on the stall wall, not scratched this time, carved. Symbols deeper and sharper than any before. Circles intersected with jagged lines, a large spiral drawn over the others as if to erase them. The message below read, "He will walk again." Dylan stared at it. It wasn't the goat who did that. Sarah agreed. She checked the exterior cellar door again, still locked. No sign of tampering. But the smell from beneath had intensified. It curled into the air even through the cracks, damp and rotting. They returned to the house, and Sarah retrieved the box of old journals Alma had left them. Most were filled with ramblings, entries about bad harvests, strange dreams, neighbors disappearing into the woods. But one journal, marked with a leather strap, had a different tone. The handwriting was neat, almost precise. The author, whose name was never mentioned, wrote only in short, clipped phrases. Sarah flipped through pages until one line stopped her. "If he returns, feed him silence." She read it aloud. "What does that mean?" Dylan asked. She didn't know, but it echoed in her mind. The next night, they stayed outside the barn just before 3 a.m. They sat on the porch with blankets wrapped around their shoulders, flashlight and phone in hand. Sarah's grip on the old cellar key was tight. Time passed. No scream, just the hum of insects and the sound of the wind shifting in the trees. Then, at 3:04 a.m., the goat made a sound. Not a scream. A wail. It was low, mournful, vibrating through the ground like a pulse. It didn't stop. It dragged on, longer and longer, until Sarah thought it might tear the animal apart. Then suddenly, silence. Total. And then, scratches. From beneath the ground. They could hear it from the porch. Slow, steady, wood being gouged, stone shifting. Sarah stood. Dylan grabbed her arm. "Don't go in there." She looked down at him, voice dry. "We don't have a choice." The next morning, Sarah found new carvings on their back door. This time, not symbols, words. Etched deep and furious into the wood, all caps, uneven. "Let me out." Sarah stood over the cellar door, one hand wrapped around the cold iron key. Dylan stood behind her, barefoot, silent. Neither of them had spoken about the words carved into the door. They had simply stared at them and walked away, but the message lingered. "Let me out." Sarah unlocked the door slowly. The hinges screamed louder than the goat ever had. The smell rolled out immediately, damp, sour, layered with rot. This time she came prepared. Gloves, a heavier flashlight, a small knife tucked into her coat pocket. She looked back at Dylan. "You don't come down. Not unless I call." He nodded once. Then she stepped onto the stone stairs. The descent was slower than before. Every footstep echoed. The walls seemed to press closer the farther down she went. By the time she reached the bottom, the beam of her flashlight barely cut through the darkness. The air was thick, oppressive, as if it carried weight. The cellar hadn't changed, but now she saw it clearly. The carvings were older than she'd thought. Some had been etched into the stone itself, not just the wooden beams. Symbols repeated again and again, eyes, spirals, jagged mouths. One wall was covered entirely in what looked like names. Dozens, maybe hundreds, all scratched in with shaking hands. Most were barely legible. Her light moved over a small alcove. Toys, children's toys, stuffed animals eaten by time, blocks, a wooden train missing its wheels. The floor beneath them was stained dark, and the wall beside them had gouges as if tiny fingers had clawed at it. Sarah fought the urge to run. She turned, and her light caught something in the corner. A figure. She nearly screamed, but it didn't move. It was a mannequin crudely made from burlap, wood and rope. Its head was wrapped in a cloth bag, mouth drawn in charcoal, smiling wide. Nails had been driven into its hands and chest. Something was written on the sackcloth in red ink. "We fed him ourselves." She backed away. Her foot hit something solid. She turned quickly. A small chest. It wasn't locked. Inside were bones, tiny, fragile. Skulls, ribs, vertebrae arranged like an offering. A child's nightgown lay folded neatly beside them. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. She turned and ran back toward the stairs, but something else stopped her. A voice, soft, whispering. "Sarah." She froze. Her flashlight flickered. The voice came again. "Sarah, please." A boy's voice, weak, familiar. She turned in circles, light darting across the walls. "Who's there?" But the voice didn't answer again. At the top of the stairs, Dylan appeared, pale and shaking. "I heard it," he said. "It said your name." She climbed the steps 2 at a time and shut the door hard behind her. Locked it. Her hands wouldn't stop shaking. Dylan looked up at her. "He's still there, isn't he?" She nodded. They didn't go back to the barn that day. Instead, they sat in the kitchen, the journal open in front of them. Sarah turned to the final page. Only 5 words had been written. "He doesn't want to sleep." That night, they didn't wait for the scream. They heard laughter instead, high, breathy, hollow. It floated through the house like a draft, brushing the curtains, rippling the glasses on the counter. And at 3 a.m., the goat began to weep. Not cry, weep. Low, long, broken sounds. Dylan curled on the couch with a blanket pulled to his chin. Sarah sat beside him, staring out the window toward the barn. Somewhere beneath that earth, something was awake now, something that had never stopped watching. Sarah hadn't called the police until that morning. Not after the goat screamed, not after the symbols or the bones, not after the laughter. But something about the weeping finally broke her. It was too human. She dialed the number with trembling hands, not expecting much. When Sheriff Tom Rayleigh answered, his tone was flat, as if he'd been waiting. "I need someone to come out," she said. "There's something under the barn." "You said that last time," he replied. "I went down there. There are bones, symbols. Something's moving down there. Something's alive." A long silence. Then, "I'll come." He arrived an hour later. His cruiser kicked up dust as it rolled into the driveway. He stepped out slowly, wearing his uniform and a tired expression. He looked older than Sarah remembered. Grayer, like the land had taken something from him too. "Where?" he asked. She led him to the barn. The goat didn't move when they entered. It stood quietly, eyes low, as if mourning. Sarah pointed to the locked door at the back. "Down there." He approached the door, paused with his hand on the handle. "You sure you want this open?" "No," she said. "But it's already awake." Rayleigh didn't reply. He unlocked the door and slowly descended. Sarah waited at the top, Dylan beside her. 10 minutes passed, then 15. Finally, the sheriff returned. His face was pale, his shirt stained with sweat. He didn't speak at first, just locked the door behind him and stepped away. "You'll seal that entrance again," he said. "No one goes back down there." "What is it?" Sarah asked. He didn't meet her eyes. "It's not for you to know." She stepped in front of him. "You already knew, didn't you?" He hesitated, then gave a slow, reluctant nod. "It was buried for a reason," he said. "And the goat, he was put here to keep it that way." Sarah blinked. "What do you mean?" "The goat isn't screaming for himself. He's screaming to hold it down." Dylan spoke up. "It's been breaking through." Rayleigh turned toward the boy, startled. "You've heard it." "I've seen it." The sheriff looked like he might be sick. "It's supposed to stay quiet." "That's all we were told. Keep the barn sealed, let the goat live, don't let anyone dig. The old ones made a pact, long before I was born." Sarah's voice sharpened. "You're telling me you knew children died here and just left it?" Rayleigh looked away. "We did what we had to do to keep it sleeping." Sarah's hands curled into fists. "What happens if it wakes up?" Rayleigh's silence was all the answer she needed. He turned to leave. "You burn this place if you have to, but don't go back down." As his car disappeared down the road, Sarah felt something tighten in her chest. It wasn't closure. It wasn't safety. It was dread. That night, they reinforced the cellar door. nailed it shut, barred it with wood and old furniture. And still at 3 a.m. the goat screamed. It was the loudest yet. It rose like a siren, shaking the walls, rattling the windows. A single light bulb in the kitchen burst. Dylan covered his ears, sobbing. And beneath the noise another sound, not loud, but clear. Whispers, dozens of them, layered, foreign, in voices that didn't belong, and then, just as suddenly, it stopped. The air dropped in temperature. The house grew still. Sarah rose to her feet, heart pounding. She looked at Dylan. "We're not safe here anymore." He didn't argue. Outside in the barn, the goat collapsed. The barn was silent the next morning. Too silent. Sarah stood at the entrance, afraid to walk in. The air was thick with something old and heavy. Dylan stayed at the edge of the field, watching her, arms crossed over his chest like he was holding himself together. The goat didn't move. It lay curled in the straw, eyes half open, body trembling with each slow breath. It didn't acknowledge her presence. It didn't make a sound. She knelt beside it, reaching out carefully. Its fur was damp with sweat, its ribs rising and falling in short, uneven bursts. She whispered softly, not knowing why. "I'm sorry." She stayed there until Dylan called out. "Alma's here." The old truck had returned. Alma stepped out slower than before, her expression unreadable. She didn't approach the barn. She just stood near the fence and looked at Sarah like someone who had already grieved too many times. "You said he was waking up again," Sarah began. Alma nodded. "Because the goat is failing. You knew what was under there this whole time. We all did." Sarah felt anger surge through her. "And you just let people move in? Let kids live here?" Alma looked down. "He needs the land. He doesn't care who tends it, only that the blood doesn't stop." Sarah's voice dropped. "What is it?" Alma didn't answer at first. Then softly, "Not a who, a hunger." Dylan walked up beside them. "What do we do?" Alma turned to him. "You listen." She opened the back of her truck and pulled out a worn leather book. It looked older than anything Sarah had seen, bound with wire, covered in mold. She handed it to Sarah with shaking hands. It was written by the first settlers here. They called it the binding, a ritual to keep the hunger sealed, but the last one wasn't completed. That's why he stirs. Sarah flipped through the pages. Symbols, instructions, bones. "Why a goat?" she asked. Alma stared toward the barn. "Because they understand suffering. And they don't lie." Sarah closed the book. "What does the ritual require?" Alma didn't answer. The silence said enough. Dylan spoke. "We're not killing him." Sarah agreed. "There has to be another way." Alma said nothing more. She walked back to her truck, but before getting in, she looked at Sarah one last time. "If you don't bind him, he'll choose someone else." The truck disappeared down the road. That night, Sarah laid the book open on the kitchen table. Dylan sat beside her, reading silently. His fingers traced the drawings, circles around bones, symbols burned into ash. One page stood out. It showed a figure kneeling before a stone pit, a voice rising behind it, and a phrase written in English beneath the drawing, "Feed it silence or feed it blood." Sarah whispered it aloud. The room felt colder after she said it. She rose and walked to the window. The barn was still. The stars above it looked dimmer than usual. Dylan stood beside her. "What if it takes one of us?" Sarah closed her eyes. "Then we don't give it the chance." At 3 a.m. the scream didn't come. Not from the barn, not from the goat. It came from the ground, low, rattling, deep, like the earth itself had found a voice, and it wanted to be heard. The next morning came with a silence so complete it felt staged. No wind, no birds, not even the creak of old wood settling in the farmhouse. Just an unnatural stillness, as though the world had stopped breathing. Sarah sat on the porch, eyes locked on the barn. She hadn't slept. Neither had Dylan. At sunrise, she went to check on the goat. It was still lying in the straw, motionless. For a long moment, she thought it was dead, but when she stepped closer, its chest rose slowly. Its eyes fluttered open, dull, cloudy, no longer alert. The screaming was over. Sarah whispered the name she hadn't dared speak until now. Gideon! The name had been scrawled in the journals, in the walls of the cellar, in the final pages of the binding. As long as Gideon bleeds, the seal holds. But he wasn't bleeding anymore. She stepped back slowly and left the barn. Dylan was in the kitchen, drawing again. He hadn't spoken since the scream from beneath the house. "What are you drawing?" she asked gently. He pushed the paper toward her. It was a crude sketch of the cellar, the pit, the mannequin, the carvings. But this time, there was something new. A figure at the bottom, thin, hollow-eyed, arms reaching upward. Sarah's throat tightened. "You saw that?" He nodded. "Last night." "In my dream." Her voice shook. "Did it speak?" He didn't answer. Instead, he whispered, "It's hungry." She sat beside him, heart pounding. "We need to finish the ritual." Dylan looked up. "But what if it's already too late?" The rest of the day passed in silence. Sarah tried to call the sheriff again, but there was no answer. She drove into town, but the station was closed. No sign of Rayleigh. No deputies, no cars. It was like he'd vanished. Back home, she found Dylan in the attic, sitting in front of the open trunk where they'd found the keys. He held the binding in his lap, flipping through the pages without reading. "There's more writing," he said. She stepped closer. On a blank page near the end, new words had appeared. In the same sharp handwriting as before, "He's listening now." Sarah slammed the book shut. That night the house felt colder. At 3 a.m. there was no scream, no scratching, no movement from the barn. But the silence was worse. Sarah wandered the halls, unable to sleep, unable to stay still. Dylan had fallen asleep on the couch, the binding clutched to his chest like a blanket. She tucked it under his arm and kissed his forehead. Then she checked the barn again. Gideon was gone. The stall was empty. No straw disturbed, no blood. Just a single hoofprint near the door, and a spiral drawn in the dust. Sarah spun around, flashlight beam darting. No goat, no tracks, only the cold. She returned to the house in a panic and found Dylan's blanket on the floor. The binding lay beside it. The door was wide open. "Dylan!" she screamed. Nothing. She ran through the rooms, up the stairs, back out to the barn. Still nothing. Then she saw it. The cellar door, unsealed, wide open, and the ladder. Fresh footprints on the steps. One large, one small. She shouted again. No response. Her voice echoed down the stone stairwell like a challenge. Something had taken her son. Or worse, he'd gone willingly. Sarah didn't hesitate. She grabbed the flashlight, a hammer from the tool drawer, and ran to the barn. Her feet pounded the ground like her heartbeat, heavy, erratic, full of dread. The cellar door stood wide open. She didn't call for Dylan again. There was no use. If he could hear her, he wasn't answering. If something else could, she didn't want to invite it closer. She gripped the rope and descended, faster this time, swallowing her fear with every step. The walls seemed to breathe. At the bottom, the flashlight beam flickered as she turned, scanning the chamber. "Dylan?" Silence. Something cold touched her ankle. She jumped, then looked down. Blood. A thin line of it snaked along the dirt floor, disappearing into the dark. She followed it. Past the mannequin, which had changed, it now had eyes drawn over the sackcloth, open, watching. Its smile had been darkened with something fresh. She didn't stop. The blood led to a part of the chamber she hadn't seen before, a second passage hidden behind a fallen beam. She squeezed through, her jacket catching on the wood, tearing the sleeve. The tunnel sloped downward. The air got colder. She heard something breathing ahead, labored, wet. Her light caught the back of a figure crouched near the far wall. It was Dylan. He was kneeling in front of an altar carved from stone, covered in moss and dried blood. His hands were shaking, his eyes unfocused. In front of him was a small bowl filled with something black and moving. "Dylan," she whispered. He didn't react. She stepped closer. "Dylan, look at me." He turned his head slowly. His eyes were open but empty. "It wants me," he said, voice distant. "No," she snapped. "You're coming back with me." "It's too late," he murmured. "He said I have to feed it." She reached for him, grabbing his arm. His skin was cold. She pulled hard. He resisted. "Dylan!" The voice behind her came like a breath. "He belongs to me now." Sarah spun. A man stood just beyond the altar, tall, thin, bones pressing against his skin like they didn't fit. His face was familiar but wrong. His eyes were too deep, his jaw too wide, yet somewhere beneath the distortion, she saw the photo from the library article. "Samuel Price," he smiled. "Thank you for returning him." Sarah stepped in front of Dylan. "You're not taking my son." Samuel tilted his head. "He's already given. He came of his own will. I only finish what was started." "What are you?" His smile grew wider. "I am what waits." She raised the hammer, but her hand trembled. Samuel didn't move. Behind her, Dylan began chanting in a language she didn't understand. "No," she said, spinning back to him. "Stop!" She dropped the flashlight and grabbed his shoulders, shaking him. "Look at me. You're not his." His eyes flickered. The chant wavered. "You're my son. You are not a sacrifice." He blinked, then cried. Sarah pulled him to his feet. Together they ran, past Samuel, who didn't give chase. He only watched, face empty. They stumbled back into the main chamber, Sarah dragging Dylan toward the rope. But at the top of the shaft, something moved. Not a person, something taller, wider. It blocked the light completely. Sarah screamed. Sarah froze. The thing blocking the cellar entrance didn't breathe, didn't shift. It just stood there, wide, unmoving, casting a shadow that swallowed the ladder, the ceiling, the hope. She gripped Dylan tighter, forcing her body between him and whatever watched from above. Then, without a sound, it moved. Not down, away. The light returned. Sarah didn't wait. She pushed Dylan toward the rope and helped him climb. Her arms ached, her chest burned, but she didn't stop. As soon as his hands gripped the floor above, she followed. They scrambled out of the cellar and slammed the door shut behind them, locking it with everything they could find. Nails, rope, heavy crates. Inside the barn, Gideon was waiting. He stood upright now, weak but alert. He met Sarah's eyes. For a moment she saw something behind them. Intelligence, recognition. He nodded. Once. Then slowly turned and walked to the stall where he had stood all these nights. Sarah stared in disbelief. "He came back." Dylan collapsed beside her, panting. "He was never trying to escape." "No," she whispered. "He was guarding the door." They didn't speak for hours. When the sun rose, Sarah made a decision. They would burn the barn. But first, she had to understand who, what, Samuel was. She returned to the journals, digging through every line, every symbol, until she found it. Not in words, but in a drawing. A boy chained underground, his face blank. Around him were spirals. Beneath him, roots. Above him, a crown of bones. She remembered the altar, the bowl, the chanting. Samuel wasn't just a man, he was a vessel. A continuation of something older, something buried and fed and worshipped in silence, and the name carved beneath the drawing, Samuel Price. She read further, and her breath caught. According to the text, the ritual had once required a son of the land to be sealed inside, willing or not. The goat was the placeholder, the sacrifice, the voice to drown out the hunger. But when the goat failed, the hunger reached out again, for blood, for a body, for a host. She turned the page and found a line underlined in red. When silence breaks, he chooses the next. Dylan. Her son had been chosen. Unless she stopped it. She ran to the barn. Gideon lifted his head as she entered. "I need your help," she whispered. The goat stepped forward. Together they approached the cellar one last time. Sarah opened the door slowly. The descent felt colder this time, heavier. The tunnel was silent. No laughter, no chanting, just stillness. And then she saw him. Samuel sat against the far wall, his wrists chained to the stone, breathing shallow. His body looked wasted, almost translucent in the flickering light. She stepped closer. His head tilted toward her. "You broke it," he rasped. She raised her flashlight. "What are you?" "I was a son," he whispered. "I went down when they asked. I stayed because he wouldn't let go. And now? I'm hollow. And he needs a new one." She swallowed hard. "Dylan won't take your place." Samuel laughed, a dry, hollow sound. "Then who will?" Sarah raised the binding. "I will." His eyes widened. The light above them dimmed, the earth trembled, and behind her Gideon screamed again. The sound Gideon made was no longer the cry of a goat. It was something ancient, older than words, older than fear. It echoed through the chamber and up the ladder shaft, shaking the stone, cracking the old wooden beams. Samuel howled, clutching his ears. "He's coming! You've summoned him!" But Sarah didn't stop. She stepped forward, reciting from the binding. The chant had no rhythm, no pattern, only fragments of syllables not meant for human mouths. Her voice shook, her tongue stung, but she spoke louder with every breath. The floor beneath her feet began to pulse. Blood seeped through the stones. Samuel convulsed, his body bending in unnatural angles. "You don't know what you're doing," he screamed. "I know exactly what I'm doing," Sarah hissed. "I'm ending it." The walls cracked. The symbols along the stone glowed faintly, pulsing with red light. Gideon stood tall at the entrance, his body trembling with effort, eyes locked on Sarah. He took a step into the circle. The goat's hooves left marks in the earth, scorching, glowing. Samuel tried to rise. Sarah pressed her palm against the altar, whispering the final line of the binding. "Feed it silence, not a soul." The red light flared. Samuel burst into flame. Not fire, but something deeper. His body cracked apart in streams of smoke and ash. His mouth stretched wide in one final silent scream. Then everything stopped. The light died. The pulsing ended. Only silence remained. Sarah collapsed to her knees, breath ragged. She looked at Gideon. He staggered. His legs gave out. He fell. Sarah crawled toward him. "No, no, stay with me." His breathing was shallow. His chest rose once. Then stillness. His eyes remained open, watching her. She felt the warmth fade from his body. Gideon was gone. The silence was complete. She heard footsteps behind her, soft, rapid. "Mom!" Dylan rushed into the chamber, arms around her in seconds. She held him tight, her body still shaking. "It's over," she whispered. He looked past her, at the blackened space where Samuel had vanished. The altar had cracked. The chains were gone. Everything was still. Together they climbed out of the cellar. When they emerged into the barn, the first light of morning had begun to rise over the horizon. Smoke curled in thin wisps from the ground. Sarah turned to Dylan. "Help me." They gathered wood, hay, broken furniture. She poured gasoline from the shed. Together they set the barn alight. The flames roared higher and higher, consuming everything, walls, beams, stalls. The fire was bright, furious, cleansing. They stood in silence, watching it burn. At the center, Gideon's body lay still. The fire surrounded him, but for a moment, just one, his eyes glowed. And then they closed. The barn collapsed in on itself. Ash and flame rose into the sky like the breath of something long buried, finally exhaled. They didn't speak. They just held each other. When the fire died, they buried what was left. No more screaming. No more scratching. Only peace. They left the next morning. There was nothing else to pack. Most of their belongings had already been abandoned, forgotten in corners of a house that never felt like home. Sarah didn't look back at the field as they drove away. Dylan stayed quiet in the passenger seat, arms crossed, eyes distant. The barn was gone. So was Gideon. For a while they didn't speak of it. Not the cellar, not Samuel, not the hunger in the dark. The road stretched on like silence, winding through Pennsylvania hills and forests, until the land no longer felt like it could hurt them. 3 weeks passed. They settled into a small apartment in a town 2 counties away. It was plain, clean, ordinary. The kind of place where no one asked questions. and no one screamed at night. Dylan slept with the lights on at first. Sarah didn't stop him. One day, a letter arrived. No return address. Inside was a single photo. The barn, burning. A goat's skull, resting on top of a blackened fence post. Dylan found it in the mailbox. He didn't say anything, just left it on the table, face down. Sarah never opened it again. She went back to work. Dylan enrolled in school. Life resumed, slowly, hesitantly, but sometimes she still heard it, not the scream, the silence that came after, a silence that seemed to stretch too long, that seemed to ask, "What will you feed me next?" She never answered, because deep down she knew it wasn't over, not completely. Something had been buried, contained. But things like that don't vanish, they sleep, they wait. And if you listen closely, if you really pay attention, you'll hear it, not a sound, not a voice, but the weight of something watching, waiting, hungry. So if you ever move to an old farmhouse, and if there's a barn no one will enter, and if a goat stands guard every night at 3 a.m., don't open the door, don't listen to the scream. And whatever you do, never break the silence. If you made it this far and your heart's still beating, thank you for listening. Don't forget to subscribe if you enjoy true horror stories like this one. We post new mysteries every week. And if you're brave enough, click the video on your screen now to keep going down the rabbit hole. What you find next might be worse than the scream. It might be the silence,